Hello, and thank you for being here. This presentation explores Sigmund Freud's foundational role in shaping grief theory, particularly through his 1917 work, Mourning and Melancholia. We'll look at his background, core concepts, clinical impact, and how his theories both support and challenge contemporary understandings of grief. I'll also share how I personally apply and adapt his ideas in grief work today, especially with the trauma-informed, culturally responsive lens. This presentation is based on multiple sources, including works by Archer, Scheer, Clewell, Freud himself, and others who've built upon or critiqued his ideas. Freud's impact on psychology. Sigmund Freud is widely regarded as the father of psychoanalysis. His groundbreaking theories reshaped psychology by emphasizing the unconscious mind, defense mechanisms, and the emotional roots of mental distress. He was one of the first theorists to suggest that our inner life, thoughts, desires, and repressed feelings significantly impacts our behavior and mental health. In terms of grief, Freud redirected attention from external mourning rituals to internal psychological processes. His ideas sparked decades of research into the nature of loss and adaptation, making Mourning and Melancholia a foundational text in the psychology of bereavement. Freud's background. Freud was born in 1856 in Freiburg, in what is now the Czech Republic. He was raised in a Jewish family during a time of growing anti-Semitism, which shaped his identity and likely contributed to his later interest in internal conflict and social marginalization. He studied medicine and neurology at the University of Vienna and collaborated with Jean-Martin Charcot and Joseph Breuer, developing what became known as the talking cure. Importantly, Freud's theoretical work on grief was informed by personal loss. The deaths of his father and later his daughter Sophie left a profound emotional mark. These losses pushed Freud to explore not just grief's emotional toll, but also its unconscious dimensions. Mourning and Melancholia. In Mourning and Melancholia, Freud drew a distinction between two types of grief. Mourning is a healthy, conscious response to loss where the individual gradually withdraws emotional energy or libido from the deceased. It's a process of letting go and eventually reinvesting in life. Melancholia, on the other hand, is pathological. The person internalizes the lost object and turns feelings of anger, guilt, or disappointment inward, leading to self-reproach and depressive symptoms. Freud saw melancholia as an unconscious identification with the lost person, which prevents the mourner from moving forward. This idea was an early forerunner of what we now call complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder, where individuals feel stuck and unable to adapt to their loss. Later psychoanalytic contributions to grief. Freud's theory introduced two major ideas that deeply influenced later grief work. First, he offered the idea of grief as a key part of ego development, meaning that how we process losses can shape our sense of self. Second, the concept of identification with the lost object helped explain how unresolved grief can manifest as symptoms of depression or anxiety. These ideas laid the foundation for later models of complicated grief and for understanding why some people seem unable to detach from a lost loved one. While Freud didn't use terms like trauma or PTSD, His descriptions of melancholia closely mirror those modern diagnoses, especially in cases involving guilt, identity confusion, or emotional numbness. Impact on mental health. Freud's ideas had a major impact on how clinicians understand and treat grief. His work informed early psychodynamic models of bereavement and paved the way for later thinkers like Bowlby, Kubler-Ross, and Worden. Each of these theorists, in their own way, built upon the idea that grief is an emotional and psychological process, not just a series of outward behaviors. Freud also influenced how grief and depression are categorized in diagnostic systems like the DSM. The blurred lines between melancholia and depression remain relevant today, especially when clinicians are trying to determine whether a client's grief is within a normative range or has become something more clinical, such as major depressive disorder or prolonged grief disorder. Cultural worldviews and Freud's theory. One of the critiques of Freud's theory is that it reflects a Eurocentric, individualistic worldview. He focused almost entirely on intrapsychic processes, the internal workings of the mind, while ignoring the communal and cultural aspects of grief. In many cultures, grief is shared through ritual, storytelling, or collective mourning, but Freud's model leaves little room for these practices. Additionally, his theories were largely based on middle and upper class European men and women in early 20th century Vienna. As a result, the theory often centers male experiences of grief and overlooks the influence of gender roles, family systems, or social inequalities. These limitations make it difficult to apply Freud's theory universally without modification. Theoretical systematic biases. Freud's theory also contains several systematic biases. First, it tends to pathologize intense or prolonged grief, framing it as melancholia, rather than recognizing that grief can be a lifelong, non-linear process, especially in the face of sudden, traumatic, or disenfranchised losses. Second, his reduction of grief to a libidinal detachment process misses other important aspects, such as cognitive processing, social identity, and spiritual meaning-making. Modern grief theorists have since emphasized that grief often involves holding on to the memory or essence of the deceased in healthy ways. Freud's binary, either withdraw or become melancholic, doesn't allow room for resilience, post-traumatic growth, or ongoing connection with the person who died. Ethical issues. Freud's approach also raises ethical questions, both historically and in terms of its legacy. In early psychoanalysis, there were no standards for informed consent, privacy, or boundaries as we know them today. The therapist often imposed their interpretations, like analyzing dreams or symbols, without the client's input or empirical grounding. These methods could be subjective and even harmful. Today, modern grief counseling emphasizes ethical principles like autonomy, cultural humility, and evidence-based practice. Trauma-informed care also reminds us to avoid re-pathologizing clients for having strong emotional responses to devastating losses. In many ways, the ethical standards we use now were shaped in response to some of the overreaches of early psychoanalytic practices. Personal summary and application. In my grief work, I find Freud's theory helpful for conceptualizing internal grief experiences, particularly guilt, emotional numbness, and identity confusion. Clients who feel stuck or say they lost themselves after a death often reflect elements of melancholia. I use Freud's language and insights when supervising interns or explaining complex grief dynamics. However, I always adapt the theory. Freud's model lacks emotional safety, cultural flexibility, and relational depth. So I integrate his insights into a broader framework that includes narrative therapy, expressive arts, attachment theory, and trauma-informed care. By blending old theory with new tools, I can better support clients from diverse backgrounds and with unique grief stories. Thank you.